Welcome everybody to another 2025 winter Mountain Zoom edition. We're glad to have you all here this evening, and it's um, uh, it's a good honor great honor to have the couple of speakers that we have here this evening with us to talk about a couple of timely subjects, especially the HPAI. Seems to be in the news every day, but we we'll have this recorded and we'll be able to put it up on our YouTube channels later. I know Shad always sends it to the government channel as well, and so everybody can share this with folks that didn't make it this evening. But this evening, from the Virginia side of the line, we have Ethan Chapmon. And then also from the Kentucky side of the line, we have Dr. Matt Springer. And both these gentlemen are well versed in tonight's subject, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and just turn it over to Matt and Ethan and let them roll with it. So, guys, glad to have you all this evening, and you go right ahead.
Thanks, Jeremy. Can everybody hear me okay? Sounds good. All right. Well, we'll get started here. We're gonna open with a little talk and overview of what chronic wasting disease is. For a lot of you, this may be some review, but I hope that some of it might be new information that you find helpful. This presentation, the slides were created by our wildlife health coordinator, Alexandra Lombard, and modified by myself. And so we'll just jump right in. I don't know if we can do a showing of hands on the Zoom meeting here, or if some of you guys are aware of how to do that, but I'll just throw this question out here. Which deer, by looking at these photos, would you think has CWD? Not sure if we're going to be able to do the hand raising or not, but it's a trick question, really. You can't tell, and for reasons that we'll get into a little bit later on in the talk. Both of these deer look healthy, but either one of them or both of them could have CWD. So just kind of going over what chronic wasting disease is, it's often misunderstood and blasted in the headlines of different on news programs and different forms of media as zombie deer disease. Sometimes it's confused with other deer diseases like hemorrhagic disease. CWD is quite different and distinct from everything else that affect whitetail deer and other members of the family Cervidae. So in Virginia and in Kentucky, that means whitetail deer and elk are at risk for being infected with this disease. CWD belongs to a special group of diseases called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. It's such a mouthful that we always refer to them as TSEs for short. And it's caused by an infectious prion, which is nothing but a misfolded protein particle, very different from the causes of other sources of diseases that you're probably more familiar with, like viruses and bacterial diseases. So we'll get into that a little bit in the next couple of slides. The big thing is with CWD, unfortunately, there is no treatment or cure for deer, moose, and elk that come down with this disease. So TSEs, as the name implies, they cause sponge-like holes to form in the brain of the host that it infects. So you've got bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow disease is the common name for that. Something you guys are probably more familiar with. Scrapie in sheep and goats, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, and Kuru in humans. Chronic wasting disease appears to be separate and only affecting members of the deer family at this current moment. Unlike the image there on the right that shows rapid deterioration of the brain and Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, CWD is a little bit more on the slow side of things, affecting deer and elk and moose on a more of a slower pace. A prion is a proteinaceous infectious particle. Fancy way to say it's just a protein. And here pictured on the right, you've got a normal prion there. And what makes this one on the bottom infectious is its misfolding. And that's what causes disease over time in deer. At this current moment, there are no known confirmed cases of CWD in humans, but because it's similar in the same family as other diseases that have impacted people, there is strong caution being suggested out there, but by the CDC, recommendations have been made that folks that eat venison do so at their own volition, and that they get deer tested if the deer was originated from a CWD positive area, not to consume it if it came from an area known to have CWD without having it tested. And it's good to wait on those test results. So I know we as hunters, especially I'm a hunter myself. When I get a deer, I don't like to wait very long, but uh, eventually, hopefully, this is a long time from now, but when this part of Southwest Virginia gets looped into a disease management area, I'm going to be waiting on test results before I make a decision to consume that meat. And those are the general guidelines and advice that has been given. Um, we also want to keep meat from different animals separated so that you don't confuse those. You want to wait until those test results come back and before you consider mixing those meats together. And in between deer, if you're a hunter and you process multiple deer a year, it's a good idea to clean equipment between processing each deer. There's some scientific literature out there, some solid evidence that suggests that soaking your equipment in a 40% bleach solution after you scrub it down with the soap and water can help, is the best management practice right now we have for deactivating those prions on your equipment. You also want to avoid kind of cutting through and handling any sort of the most high risk parts that you don't have to, where those prions like to concentrate in the deer, and that includes the spinal cord. I know if you harvest a nice buck and you want to have it mounted, that does require cutting through the skull or the spinal cord, but when possible, try to avoid doing that and to minimize your risks. And then you want to always wear gloves whenever you're handling any sort of wild game, but there's no exception here with CWD. So how is CWD transmitted? Well, primarily it's from deer to deer through grooming, marking, and mating. They shed these prions in their body fluids, urine and feces, and so they can actually pick it up also from the environment, though. These prions are pretty hardy, very temperature resistant. They can last in the environment for many years, and in the soil, they can remain infectious for other deer that come by, including CWD positive deer that die and decompose on the landscape. There's some scientific articles that demonstrate that plants can actually uptake prions in their vascular tissues, thereby being a potential transmission pathway for herbivores like deer to come by and eat those parts of the plant and become infected that way. So it's as you can tell, it's a very complex disease in terms of management and trying to figure things out for a state agency like DWR in Kentucky. So it's a very complicated disease. There's other ways it can move around on the landscape, and we're finding more and more about that seemingly every year. I recall a recent study out of Mississippi State looking at raccoons possibly moving prions around mechanically. So on the pads of their little paws, going from different feeding stations that folks had up for deer, moving prions around mechanically on the landscape. So we're learning all sorts of ways. Certainly scavengers play a role in that as well. So it's a difficult disease to manage. The clinical signs of CWD often take a good while to develop, as I mentioned earlier. It's a long incubation period between the time when a deer is first infected with a prion until it actually shows up as clinical symptoms. And oftentimes that's a year and a half plus, maybe 2 years or more, that animal could be infected and shedding prions out in the environment and to other deer, but otherwise look super healthy, just like a normal deer to you and I. Once the symptoms do appear, that's the late stage of the disease. At that point, it's not very long before that animal will die. But during that last final stage, they usually are super emaciated, hence the term wasting disease. They look very skinny. Their bones are protruding. They often exhibit a combination of symptoms. So it's not just being skinny. They're also demonstrating some neurological deficits, some signs like loss of fear of humans. They seem confused. They often have their legs spread out apart and their head and ears drooped real low. Sometimes they're salivating excessively, and they're just otherwise just not well. Sometimes they'll pace or walk erratically in circles. I do want to point out that anytime you see these neurological signs, that doesn't necessarily mean it's CWD. Lots of causes for neurological problems like these, including injuries to deer from vehicle collisions or from fighting, or even pathogens and some parasites. Some parasitic infections can cause similar symptoms. So it's unlikely that you see a deer at this stage. And we'll talk a little bit more about how many clinical suspects we had in Virginia out of the total number that we've sampled a little later on in the presentation. So why should we care about CWD? Here in Virginia, DWR considers this to be the most significant threat to Virginia's white-tailed deer population. It has potential impacts to population growth rates. In out west, where CWD's been around a lot longer, they've seen some declines in their deer herds. In fact, in one county here, a little closer to home here in West Virginia, it's the highest cause of known deer mortality in Hampshire County. Hampshire County, I believe, has had CWD, or at least they've known about it since the early 2000s. I believe 2004 was their first positive. And it shares a border with Virginia up in Frederick County, where we got our first positive back in 2009. Of course, fewer does. When CWD really hits a herd hard, and over time the prevalence rate goes up. When you have fewer does, of course, you have fewer fawns, and so you have stunted population output. With a year and a half to 2 years incubation period on this disease, deer can live with it for a while. But if you consider that a buck fawn, if it was infected at birth, it would not make it past about 2 years of age before it probably dies.
That afterpay thing.
That definitely impacts for folks that are interested in managing their deer herd for older age classes, folks interested in managing for bucks with better antler quality. That has strong implications for that. So deer are also important in Virginia and Kentucky. They're part of our ecosystems, and they play a significant role in our economies and hunting traditions, and of course a source of food. And here in Virginia, people love watching deer. They're a mainstay, kind of an iconic species. For folks that don't even like to hunt, everyone loves to look out their window and see deer. So we intend on keeping them around for years and years to come. We don't want CWD to get in the way of that. A little snapshot timeline wise of how CWD, when we first found it and where it was in the 60s at a research facility in Colorado. And it was about a decade later that it was found in the wild for the first time, actually in an elk in Colorado as well. And it was the early 2000s before it was picked up for the first time in white-tailed deer. And then 2009 for us here in Virginia. And I mentioned earlier that was a spillover from West Virginia, who were struggling with CWD before we were. And sure enough, we started looking for it in, I think, 2002. And I think West Virginia had their first one in 2004. And then it was 2009 when we picked up our first positive. Today, we've tested a lot of deer. I think over 50,000 whitetails since 2002. And I'm not sure that even includes this most recent year. We haven't finalized up all of the tallies. We actually haven't got all of our samples sent off to the lab for this year. We're still collecting samples. Some of our seasons in Virginia go on throughout the spring. So I don't have updated numbers from this past season yet to provide to you. But as of the start of this past season, 253 white-tailed deer have been tested positive for CWD since 2009. And we've had positive detections in 15 different counties. Only 11 of the 253 were actually clinical suspects, so showing outward signs that made us suspect that it had CWD. The rest of those, which are about 96% of those, were otherwise they looked healthy, and the hunter did not know any different. So the large majority of these deer were hunter harvested deer. And I bring that up because I want to emphasize the role that hunters play in conservation and management and surveillance for this disease. We couldn't do what we do without hunters, and for multiple reasons. Here in Virginia, we now have 4 disease management areas across the state. The closest one to us is DMA 4, which came about as a result of a Tazewell County positive back in 2023. So it's definitely advancing southward and westward, which is not the direction we would like to see it here in Southwest Virginia. But we've got several different steps that we've taken as an agency to try to minimize spread and increase surveillance. So we've got kind of 3 pillars that we stand on to help prop up our CWD management plan. And the first of those is preventing spread to new areas, of course. And so we've got some restrictions in place, just like other states do. If you like to hunt out of state, that's great, but you can't bring a whole carcass or high-risk parts directly into Virginia for obvious reasons. In addition to that, we've also made some carcass transport restrictions within the state. So we don't want folks moving deer across the landscape out of CWD areas into new areas. As I mentioned earlier, those prions can get in the soil, in the plants, and last a long time in the environment and remain infectious. So anything we can do as hunters and as conservationists to minimize the spread, that is our biggest tool in our pocket right now. We've also prohibited any new captive deer facilities. The ones that we've had here in Virginia, we're no longer issuing new permits for those. There's a couple that are grandfathered in. I think we may have one in Southwest Virginia, but anytime that there's a change of ownership or they close shop, those permits will not be reissued. We also prohibit high fence deer hunting here in Virginia, and fawn rehabilitation within a disease management area is prohibited to minimize the risk of moving fawn accidentally back out on the landscape that could have CWD. Our second pillar that we use to kind of prop up our CWD management program is minimizing the spread in areas that we already have established CWD. And so here the focus is really keeping our firm grip on the deer population, keeping our deer densities lower than our environment can support. We definitely don't want a high deer density in a disease, in an issue with disease like this, because high deer densities can potentially transmit that disease across the landscape even faster. And so we want to keep hunters, give them plenty of opportunities to take antlerless deer so that we can keep that strong grip on the deer herd. And we've liberalized seasons, early and late antlerless only firearm seasons. They run in conjunction with early and late urban archery seasons as well. Wherever we've had CWD that formerly had antler point restrictions in place to help motivate hunters to walk the small bucks and manage for older age class bucks, but also better quality antlers, we've had to remove those in light of CWD, because we don't want to permit and even support the idea of bucks living a long time in areas where we're struggling to fight CWD. So those have been removed within 25 miles of detections. We're not saying that you can't walk a small buck if you live in a CWD area, but we just didn't want to put those legal restrictions on folks. Also, hunting over bait is prohibited statewide. That's been that way for a while. But within a DMA, feeding is prohibited year round. So even outside of a hunting context, feeding is prohibited year round in those counties and within 25 miles of a positive detection. And then the third pillar of our CWD program is surveillance, of course. We want to test as many deer as we can, and we want to encourage hunters to have their deer tested. We want to find, kind of track the prevalence rates in our different disease management areas over time so that we can understand how to adjust our regulations. And we also want to find it in new places. If there is an outbreak CWD in an area we didn't expect it, we want to know about that sooner rather than later so that we can make the necessary changes to hunting seasons and regulations. And we want to make this free to hunters. So we've got voluntary fridge drop stations scattered throughout our disease management areas. There is free testing through certain processors and taxidermists, including some that are outside of the disease management areas. We have some in the Wise District. And mandatory testing day, that is the opening day of the general firearm season. In our disease management areas, that is what we call mandatory day. So if you shoot a deer on that day, you're required to bring it in and have it tested by a biologist that's working in that day, and that way we can kind of up our sample size and make sure that everybody is. It's usually a fun day. It kind of reminds us of the old check station days. We get to interact with hunters, and today that's kind of a rare thing. We don't get to do that since check station days are behind us. So it's actually a fun day. Clinical suspects in roadkill do make up a small percentage of some of the deer that we pick up and test for CWD. But as I mentioned earlier, our hunter harvested deer make up the majority of our sample size. Okay, so CWD in Virginia. The updates for this past season were Carroll and Tazewell counties, in lieu of positive detections the previous season, DMA4 was created, and that includes Bland, Smith, and Tazewell counties. Tazewell, it was confirmed that CWD was in that deer. That deer did come from Tazewell County, and our wildlife health team went through and actually got permission to do some, I believe, some reconnaissance on the ground and took some scrape samples and some stuff out in the environment, and were able to pick up CWD, I believe, that way. So it's in Tazewell. It's in Southwest Virginia. Hoping not to find it anywhere further west or south anytime soon. DMA3 also expanded to include a few extra counties. And of course, fawn rehab bans were updated so in light of those new counties being added to disease management areas, as were feeding bans and mandatory testing day for those counties as well. So here you can see shaded in red are year-round feeding bans. And you may notice that Wise, Dickinson, Buchanan, a few other counties that aren't in a disease management area currently have some year-round feeding bans. I know for Wise, Dickinson, and Buchanan, I think that was based on the fact that we're trying to restore elk to that part of Virginia. We're very proud of that, and we want to safeguard elk. And that was the primary reason for that. But if you're asking my opinion, I would love to see a statewide year-round prohibition on feeding deer. And so we'll see. I know that I'm not the only one with that opinion. I'm hoping that we could maybe get that off and running here in the next few years in legislation. So what can we do? Well, we definitely don't want to feed deer. Deer obviously are concentrated at baiting sites and mineral licks and things like that. And so we don't want to encourage deer to come across the landscape and be concentrated in such manner. So comply with feeding restrictions. We also want you to comply, if you're a hunter, with all carcass transport restrictions. We know that here in Southwest Virginia, we share borders with several different states, and there could be temptation to just hop across the border, but it's really important that we keep abreast of all of those regulations and that we follow those as conservationists. Of course, if you do notice a deer that's acting funny and it's showing signs and symptoms consistent with CWD, we want you to report those, and you can call our wildlife conflict helpline. And if you don't have time to write this down right now, don't worry, this number will come up again later on. Definitely don't feed deer. That's the big takeaway. If you've got questions about CWD in Virginia, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is on the screen. And then Alexandra Lombard, she's our wildlife health coordinator. She heads off our CWD management program here. She's also open to taking questions as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Springer, and he's going to talk about Kentucky's response to CWD.
Thanks, Ethan. And we're making a valiant effort here to minimize repetition as we go through both these diseases. So Ethan did a great job there covering a lot of the background of CWD, and I'm going to focus specifically on what's going on in Kentucky here. We have had a much shorter lived relationship with CWD. It's only been since December of 2023. But we have had a long time trying to make sure that CWD was found on the landscape if it was present. And much of our efforts over the last 20 plus years now have been on the CWD surveillance. Our surveillance in Kentucky is meant to identify any locations that have CWD present, mostly for public health concerns, as well as herd health, and potentially altering any management strategies that would be needed for those populations. Our surveillance in Kentucky is based off of a model that's used by many, many state agencies, including Virginia, that is going to prioritize certain areas that may or may not have high risks for higher numbers of samples. So here's an example of that in the 2023-2024 hunting season. This is immediately after CWD or was detected in just south of Callaway County in Western Kentucky, so 8 miles from our border in Tennessee, was a positive, which prompted our state to issue a CWD surveillance zone and the areas immediately surrounding that within a 50-mile buffer. So any counties that were within that zone, and then along with that, there was increased surveillance efforts, mandatory check stations in certain counties, feeding bans, and so on and so forth. It is all lined out in our CWD response plan that the state agency is implementing based on any positives that were found. So you'll notice if you look at the map here, areas in that zone in far western Kentucky near that CWD positive in Tennessee had samples approaching almost 1,000 in certain counties. And during that year, despite the fact that there was roughly, was it somewhere around 3,000 to 4,000 samples within 5 counties were collected, no CWD was actually detected. We also had another focal area in eastern Kentucky related to elk hunting. Much of that is the sample numbers are high because it's a combination of both a pretty strong elk population with check stations that are going on with harvested elk and samples being collected, as well as a deer harvest that was occurring in those zones and voluntary drop-off locations. We're trying and still trying to meet all our goals related to the point system that is created to try to meet what some folks that are, basically mathematicians and statisticians have determined will guarantee detection if CWD is at 1%. And that's kind of the idea behind it. Now, any positives trigger a swamping of surveillance in those areas, and you'll see that as we move forward here and discuss our CWD history in the state of Kentucky. All these samples, for the most part, prior to 2023 season, are all volunteer collected. So drop-offs, taxidermists, processors, the hunter can have it. Any other deer tested free of charge still is existing in that fashion, similar to Virginia. We don't want this to be any kind of burden on the hunters or anyone that wants to get a deer tested at all. Ethan, if you can hit the next slide, please. So our world kind of changed a little bit in December 2023 with our first positive detection in a healthy hunter harvested 2.5-year-old buck within Ballard County, which actually was out of our initial CWD surveillance zone. However, it was right on the border of the zone. The CWD detection was determined by 2 different tests, and also genetic analyses was done, and all of it came back to yes, we have CWD in Kentucky. That prompted further escalation of our CWD management plan to occur in that area in Western Kentucky. Within that plan, which was created almost 10 years ago now, there are specific thresholds that need to be met for actions to occur, right? So a near positive within so many miles of our border, a positive within our border, and then a certain number of positives within an area will trigger certain previously approved management strategies. And so far, with the density of 1 positive wild detection within the state of Kentucky, which is where we are at this point after 2 years of having CWD in Kentucky, we have no changes to our hunter structure in terms of seasons, bag limits. Where this positive occurred is an area of the state where there is no limit on antlerless deer. So it is unfortunately in an area of our state that has a very high deer density. which for disease management, specifically CWD management, that complicates things a little bit because we'd have escalated risk of spread through the population given the higher number of animals within a specific set area. All of this, you know, we now have an increase of almost 3,500 samples being collected within our surveillance zones. Almost all of that is now at volunteer um, from hunters, but there are a lot of check stations going on where hunters are required to go to those stations. Now, last year it was only the first weekend of gun season. After that, it was a volunteer hunter harvest drop off or collection occurred in a similar fashion with taxidermists and meat processors um, as it did prior to any CWD detections in the area. Next slide, please. A few months ago, our world changed again in a very much different region in the state of Kentucky, where we had a first positive in a captive cervid facility of a 4-year-old doe that was harvested for meat at the facility. It was confirmed in a similar fashion on multiple tests, and it was actually performed as part of the required herd certification program by USDA. Within Kentucky, our management of captive cervid facilities are a little different than Virginia. It's co-managed by both the KDA, Kentucky Department of Agriculture, and Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. We have a little over 100 of these facilities in the state. There are restrictions in place in terms of importing animals from any state that has a positive CWD herd or a positive CWD detection in captive facilities. So there's not a lot of movement between states going on here, which is one of the concerns when a positive popped up within the state itself. This prompted new actions, including another surveillance zone being established within the immediate counties surrounding this positive. So it's a 3-county area. There's additional surveillance that immediately got put in place with 1,000 samples being collected. However, there's basically no positives at this point in time with those samples that have been processed, but there's still a few that are waiting for results. There is a high deer population in this area. It's one of our top hunter harvest zones, but there's been no mandatory check stations placed at this time because the positive was found in October. Whether or not that continues into the future, as we have more time to implement recommendations or management strategies within this area, that's to be determined, but all that will be set by our commission well in advance of our next hunting season. More than likely, it'll be established within our summer meeting. That way, there's a lot of communication that can occur to our hunters in those areas. Once again, there was no change to season structure, no additional harvest to open up those potentially management strategies for reducing deer densities. However, that can all change in the future. There is if you notice here, I'm not going into a lot of the details about what Virginia did because that's the normal track that's in our CWD management plan, reducing feeding, reducing or making baiting illegal, and so on and so forth. So it all depends on how quickly this escalates and how our state will respond. If you can go to the next slide, Ethan, please. So this is kind of, for those of you who are not familiar with where Breckinridge County is, that is the 3-county zone further to the east there. That's right along the Ohio River. And then our far west zone is now been expanded with that positive that was found in Ballard County to include every county that is west of Land Between the Lakes. So this is kind of where we are envisioning potentially future positives. However, surveillance is not going to stop in areas in the rest of the state. And to be honest, we're going to blame Ethan and Virginia here. We have high concerns about the southeast corner of our state at this point in time, and there's surveillance efforts that have increased in that zone. Not because it's Ethan's fault. It's just how the biology and movement of those animals work. And obviously, there's more concern in that side because we have two cervids over there, as Virginia is also very concerned about their two cervids with both the elk and deer populations. So one of the things that is occurring on that side of the state is increased surveillance efforts. Is we have over 30 drop-off locations, volunteer drop-off locations spread throughout the state. That several of them are hosted at our county extension offices. That map is produced at the beginning of every hunting season and shared on the Fish and Wildlife website. And it's also shared in our CWD publications through our extension offices and updated annually. If you can go to the next slide. So, what is this, strategy looking like as Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife moves ahead? If you want to know what there's planning on doing, you can actually read their chronic wasting disease response and management plan, which has laid out multiple options based on how CWD may or may not progress within our state. Um, Most of our efforts, similar to Virginia, is focusing on surveillance and understanding disease distribution, primarily for information to be given to the public so they can make informed decisions about whether or not they want to consume um, potentially positive individuals, as well as knowing whether or not they should have their animals that are either harvested or if they're trying to collect roadkill or gifted deer, whether or not they want to know if those deer are potentially infected. As Ethan mentioned, CDC recommends that you do not consume these animals if they are positive, and taking precautions like waiting until you have test results, making sure you're not mixing individual animals together. And so you can track if there's a positive that you want to discard those parts through regular trash so they end up in a landfill. Same as with any harvested animal, that as you process it at home, you actually want to discard that animal in trash and not just take it down the road and throw it out the side into the right away or someone's public forest or any of the other ways that I don't want to know how you get rid of your carcass. Um, are going to, as this progresses, try to take a similar route to Virginia, use hunting as the management tool and surveillance tool. There are other states that are more aggressive. Illinois is one that has implemented sharpshooting on an annual basis to lower deer densities in their zones. And there's a lot of scientific research that's gone on looking at the effectiveness of that versus other states. But it's a balancing act, as Ethan had mentioned. This is a resource that is incredibly important to both the culture of our states as well as the economics of our states. So decisions are trying to be made with all of those in consideration. I recommend you read the surveillance zone plan and management strategies if you plan on moving or hunting in any area that falls into a CWD concern. We have all the same restrictions in Kentucky about moving animals from out of state, bringing parts in, moving animals from CWD zones into other parts of the state of Kentucky that Virginia has. So, you may not move carcass pieces that are known to be concentrated areas of CWD. So you must debone all of your meat if you harvest an animal out in Western Kentucky in that zone before you bring it across anywhere else in the state that is not in a CWD zone. If you can jump ahead there, Ethan, that'd be great. We have started some research within the state to try to gain a little bit more information about deer movement and behavior survival for our area that was CWD. Our first component of this is a study that was just funded this past year and was going to start putting GPS collars on juvenile deer in the CWD zone to track movements of those animals to try to predict any potential disease corridors to enhance surveillance efforts of the state agency. It's also trying to get some understanding of some survival parameters, reproductive parameters, so that we understand where our population is currently before it's heavily impacted by CWD potentially in the future. Obviously, we hope that doesn't happen, but if we look at how this disease tracks in other states, there's a decent chance that can happen. So we need to understand what our population looked like before CWD as best we can. That way we can make management recommendations in the future that are informed to ensure that this resource is around. Go ahead, please, Ethan. So that's kind of where we're at with CWD in Kentucky. There's a lot of information. I encourage you. We have a 3 publication series within our extension system that Jeremy or any of your extension agents in Kentucky can get you. That has up-to-date information relevant to CWD. Has links to all the resources that are updated regularly by our state agency as well as federal agency, and recommendations about the butchering protocols that you should follow. Ethan covered the soaking in bleach one, which is the best we have at this point in time, and those are being investigated. There's been a federal funding that has occurred over the last 5 years that have really allowed for some substantial advances in the understanding of CWD and management of CWD. And that has gotten some folks in the molecular world, genetics world, involved in CWD management that weren't traditionally involved. And our understanding of how this prion works and survives and moves in the landscape has probably exponentially increased in the last 5 years. The comment that was made about raccoons and hands and moving materials around that are potentially infected is all based on information we didn't have 3 years ago. The surveillance technology, the tests that we have are all brand new, so we're able to test the environment now, whereas traditionally we had to test the individual animals and only on animals that were no longer alive. So we're moving forward in leaps and bounds. Hopefully there'll be a breakthrough in the next 10 years or so. However, we've got a plan that is not going to happen, and try to make sure that this resource is available for our future generations. So with that, I don't know if we want to open it up to CWD questions before we jump into a completely different world here of avian problems.
Yeah, Matt, thank you for that coverage of Kentucky. That was excellent. And I agree with you. I think now might be an appropriate time while it's all fresh on everyone's mind. If you've got questions for either Matt or myself, drop them in the chat box. I don't know, Jeremy, could we permit folks to turn on their mic just long enough to ask a question if they'd rather do it that way?
That'll be fine. Short question will work, or drop it in the chat box, either one. I have added some links in the chat box, a couple of links from Kentucky and a link from Virginia concerning CWD.
Thanks for throwing that up there, Jeremy. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
Jeremy, does your office have one of the freezers for volunteer drop off?
Yes, sir. We Harlan County office has a freezer for the drop off, and we've had one. This makes the third deer season that we had one. And then we also this year we received some of the mail-in kits. I think I've got 8 or 10 in my office, something like that. I know Shad has some of those mail-in kits in the Letcher County office as well.
Well, if we're quiet with questions, I say I'll let you keep going, Matt, and introduce.
Power on. Yeah. All right. So we're a little bit doom and gloom today. And unfortunately, this is kind of how my life has felt the last couple of years. It seems like wildlife disease is not something I had a lot of during my academic training. I had quite a bit of CWD. I did my dissertation on predicting CWD spread in Illinois. But all the other diseases are something that has caused me to have a learning curve. And Ethan also bailed on not wanting to take this one. He took the one he was more aware of as well, and I don't blame him one bit. So we're gonna talk about something that most folks are at least aware of or have heard about, avian influenza, especially in the last 2 years since we've had some severe outbreaks. It seems every winter, but you definitely are noticing, whether or not you understand why, but if you're trying to buy a dozen eggs here lately, I don't know if you guys, but my egg prices have like tripled in our grocery store. I thought they were coming down about maybe 2 months ago, it seemed like they were. And then guess what? Waterfowl showed up in the South, and now we have major issues with egg production again. So this section is going to be a little bit vaguer in many ways because this is a pretty what's the term that we all heard, unfortunately 4 or 5 years ago, was it's a dynamic situation with this disease. So we're learning a lot, and a lot is changing as it relates to this specific strain of HPAI, or avian influenza, which is commonly referred to as H5N1. Ethan, if you could move forward, thank you. So what is HPAI, avian influenza, H5N1? Well, it's really a type A influenza virus, which I was victim to a version of that for humans here about a month ago. And all it is, right? It's an influenza virus that is predominantly found within the avian species, mostly your chickens, fowl, in terms of ducks, waterfowl, as well as turkeys. And the name itself, H5N1, just comes from how there's multiple subtypes that exist, and that H5N1 is really just the H proteins and N proteins and how they're structured on the surface of the virus. There's 16 different ways the H components can be structured, as well as, I believe you skipped ahead of me there, was 9 different ways of the N structures. And this virus has been around for decades, similar to CWD. It was actually first detected in Scotland in 1959. The first time I remember hearing about it was when I was in grade school, when they had a huge outbreak in Hong Kong, and they had many human cases at that point, with many being just under 20. However, it caught the news because it's a influenza virus, which we have been predicting as our next major epidemic for a while, after we had Spanish flu right around World War One. So it usually gets a lot of attention in the news. And there's varying levels of how this flu can occur. And it's usually identified into one of two categories, either highly or lowly pathogenic. Highly is really, you should think of it as basically a little bit more lethal, and lowly pathogenic, which actually occurs on a regular basis as well, is just, a lot of symptoms are subclinical or just really sublethal. And therefore it's not noticed as much because we're not having the issues that we have with the versions of highly pathogenic avian influenza. Please move ahead. Thank you. So some other information on this is the virus has got a pretty not as strong of a survival ability as the CWD. But when you start thinking about viruses in the environment and having the ability to survive and potentially be infectious for weeks, that causes a lot of problems in terms of prevention and management. Incubation periods can be long, and the virus survives longer in colder weather, and therefore raises risks of infection of individuals for a longer period of time, just because it's a viable virus in the landscape for longer. And many times the things that we're concerned about here in terms of birds, they're able to maneuver that virus in ways in the landscape, right? If you think about chicken and the scratching it does, it can take a virus that's in the dirt and create it airborne, allowing it then to be intaken through respiratory system, which that allows it to infect the individual. It wouldn't be as much of a concern if it was in the dirt and there wasn't any kind of mobility of that virus. So it's just, unfortunately, a symptom of the virus and the animals that tend to get infected. Though it is bird flu, there are, as I already talked about, humans have historically been infected by this. Many mammal species can be affected, and it has caused some severe mortality issues in a lot of wildlife species, mammals. There's a couple of sea lion populations, one of which on a specific island lost 95% of its reproductive output that year. So all of its young that year all died of avian influenza. So it can be quite lethal in mammals. However, thankfully, we're going to go to the next slide, please. The human component isn't so bad, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. So why is this so problematic in terms of spread? Well, we talked about the why it can be in fowl species, it can be in a lot of bird species. We tend to see it in our fowl species like chickens, our domestic, any bird that we tend to produce domestically, we test. So it tends to be found in those, but there's a pretty good case that it's probably in a lot of bird species. Whether that's waterfowl like snow geese, ducks, but we see it in positives in animals like vultures as well, and many others. There are a lot of animals that will contract this virus, both in the wild and domestic side. They'll be asymptomatic carriers, and often can then pass that disease along. They can carry more than one of the types, so they may have H5N1. They may have a different one as well. And they could exhibit or carry and spread multiple versions of this through their entire lifetime. Many species are long-lived, and it's not known how long a infected goose per se can carry and also shed the virus and infect others. So they are shedding this virus through fecal contamination. They're shedding it through respiratory, sneezing, and other excretions. And then it's possible that that fecal contamination is uptaken by other animals, insects, and moved. So there's excretion of viable virus in multiple ways from animals, but there is no evidence currently, and this is a question that gets asked a lot, that there's egg transmission, right? So if we were thinking about chickens and the fact that they can be infected quite easily, and how many eggs we consume on a regular basis as a population, that is one of the things that they do test. And right now, there is no evidence that you can acquire avian influenza by either consuming chickens or consuming chicken eggs or any other fowl. Next slide, please. So the complications of avian influenza is the fact that there's so many different reservoirs for the disease within the landscape, whether that be poultry in large scale production, backyard poultry, wild birds, which were a new positive cases that we've heard about this last summer with livestock, specifically dairy cattle. We've seen a few positives in humans. We know there's positives in other mammals. Cats are one of the big ones that have actually gotten a lot of attention here lately, and a lot of them are barn cats, probably the same interface that the cows are having. So there's a lot going on. We don't know what the spread looks like between those species to species. We know there's potential spread internally within those species, but we don't believe there's any human to human spread occurring. And there's a lot more testing of that going on. So that's a little bit more, in terms of our understanding, we have a little bit more confidence in that, thankfully at this time. However, there's a lot of mutations that occur and things can change over time. But there's a lot of movement going on. And one of the other reasons this is really hard to deal with is if you think about the behavior of birds, specifically in winter, you have two major things happening. And spring as well. You have migrations that are occurring at large scale, and you have large number of birds navigating the landscape. And with the number of waterfowl cases being higher, if you think about our area specifically, this is the time of year that we get a big migration from the north to the south of all these waterfowl coming together, and then on top of that, waterfowl and other bird species usually will have a larger flocking tendency in the winter versus other times of year when we're reproducing and want to be spread out. So you have increased number of birds that are viable carriers of disease that are migrating and moving into the area, and in large scale and high densities, all concentrated together. So you have a lot of things that do not go well for disease spread all happening at once. and also happening in areas of high production of many of the poultry products that we're concerned about. Next slide, please. Um, if you think about bird migration and how birds move, we have huge numbers of species. There are hundreds and hundreds of species that are moving through the landscape at scale. The waterfowl specifically have these things called flyways, which are kind of sections of our country that the birds typically move north to south and south to north, depending on the time of year. And it allows us to kind of predict to some extent, if you know what the positivity rate of waterfowl is within a certain flyway, you can understand the risk associated for production and so on and so forth. Not all birds that are higher carriers, it seems, follow these flyways. Vultures are one of them. You can have birds that cross flyways, so it's not perfect, but there's a lot of bird movement going on. And specifically, if we think about the two states that are here, we actually are in two different flyways. That is not a hard rule, but it is one that is pretty strong enough that we make all of our management recommendations for the game species on these flyway corridors. There are more birds that follow these flyways than do not. Next slide, please. So, what is probably a more concerning part for the people that are here is what are the human risks and potential impacts to you all. Currently, we would say that the risk is very low to humans. With this H5N1, there is not a lot of evidence. So there's been several infected individuals. We've had 67 known cases in 2024 of H5N1, all of which were, well, I shouldn't say all, almost all, minus one, were fairly mild in severity. We had one mortality associated with it, and I don't know the details of that. But historically, these infections and other infections have caused mortalities, right? I mentioned the Hong Kong outbreak in the late 90s. So we're expecting sporadic infection and also sporadic risk. However, it's been mostly minor. This primarily for us is going to be a agricultural and economic situation. You're going to have a lot of flocks of chickens in production facilities that as soon as they have a positive in that facility, they depopulate that facility to try to remove the virus from it. That means large numbers of facilities with thousands and thousands of birds being depopulated so that they can try to clean that facility and get it up and going again. And when you think about chicken egg production or chicken as a meat production, it takes a little bit to get back up and running from the meat side. So that's not going to be as impacted, but the egg production is a little bit slower to get back and going. Chickens have to mature and then start laying on a consistent basis. If you're thinking about local egg production concerns, there's some things that we're going to talk about in a little bit and what to look out for, what to potentially ask of the folks that you get your meat or eggs from on a small scale. From the human side, it is a flu virus, so there are some treatments that are available based on antivirals, just like you would for any other virus. Their effectiveness is variable, but they do have positive results in many cases. There is potential for a vaccine, but just like the annual flu vaccine that we currently get for us, there is enough mutations that it would have to be tweaked on a regular basis as well. So the problem with flus are their ability to change on a very quick generational time period, and thus, this is a kind of dynamic situation on an annual basis. Do I think you have to be dressed like the person in the bottom picture there right now? No. However, I wouldn't necessarily encourage my children to go hugging chickens anytime soon, because there is potential for spread there. Next slide, please, Ethan. The big thing here that's recommended, and this is true for if you're a agricultural producer in general or someone that has involved in the pet trade, you want to be thinking about biosecurity at all times, and that's the term biosecurity is really if you think about it a pretty aggressive term. But what it really is common sense, trying to reduce the risk of bringing in any new viruses, parasites into your population of animals, your herd, your flock, any of those things. So simply just limiting visitors to essential individuals, trying to use all of the disposable shoe covers, take foot baths, clean footwear, gloves. If you or someone that is sick, you don't want them interacting with your animals. Sick being respiratory sick. You don't want to be moving equipment around or borrowing equipment from other farms, especially other farms that have similar livestock to you. And if something pops up, you want to isolate your herds, isolate your flocks whenever possible. Um, Limit mixing of both your birds, wild and domestic, and keep them away from your livestock herds as well. Now, that's not something that we used to think about, but it's one of the things that if you have dairy cows now, we're pushing. You do not want your chickens free ranging anywhere near your dairy cows. So you may not have a chicken production facility, but maybe you have a backyard flock and you have you have other cattle. You do not want those chickens getting anywhere near that livestock now. And if your animal appears sick, you want to take action. You want to isolate them, and then have a veterinarian come out and check them so that they can come up with a diagnosis of what's going on. And that's kind of lowering your risk, right? So don't allow new people to come in. Don't be bringing new stuff in as best you can whenever possible. And as things start looking sick, try to get them isolated, figure out what's going on. Um, Risks with wildlife is a little bit harder. And biosecurity with wildlife is a little bit tougher because there's so many different animals that can carry the disease and any other disease. But there are recommendations out there, and we have recommendations on how to deal with wildlife in our extension system, whether that's for gardens and so on. Most of that is exclusion or scare devices, just to try to limit their presence in areas that could cause contamination. Specifically, so say a lot of folks have backyard flocks. You want to be thinking about, and these are all recommendations on a broader scale. You want to be thinking about monitoring that flock on a regular basis. You're probably already doing without calling it monitoring, right? You go out to feed them, you take a look, you count them, make sure that a coyote or a fox hasn't taken one away. But you're looking for any signs of sickness, illness, loss of appetite, lack of energy. If you have an animal that dies with no apparent understanding, then those are all kind of things that would raise a red flag to be either looking and monitoring your birds a little more closely. But signs of like gasping for air, difficulty breathing, nasal discharge are all signs of a bigger concern. And you definitely don't want to be moving birds around that are experiencing that. So if you're adding to your flock, which happens a lot for backyard birds, you want to try to keep those birds isolated for a period of 30 days. You also want to make sure you're bringing birds in only from National Poultry Improvement Plan sources. So those are breeders or sources of eggs and birds, chicks that have a plan in place that are monitoring for diseases like avian influenza, and they're going to basically be following best management practices. They're certified because they follow those best management practices. So you lower your risk substantially by getting animals' eggs from those producers. Once again, if you find a bird that's a problem or you're having substantial deaths that you can't explain, you want to be reporting them to your local veterinarian, local animal health diagnostic lab, state veterinary office, or USDA has a reporting line as well. We have that through KDA as well as Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources for wild birds. You don't want to ignore it. I don't want to raise an alarm, but you don't want to ignore it if you have birds that are dying. You can even reach out to your extension office depending on where you are. Jeremy, I'm not sure if our poultry folks have given you any information on what to do. I'm sure they're usually on top of things. If not, I'm sure they're going to have information coming out soon. Next slide, please, Ethan. So in Kentucky specifically, I'm going to shift gears here. That's kind of like the overall understanding of what's going on with avian influenza in terms of what it is and response, um, specifically for birds. But in Kentucky, we're really at a monitoring surveillance side of things. We don't have a lot of management actions in place outside of the USDA CDC recommendations of depopulating facilities when it's found, and so on and so forth. But from the wildlife side, we have a website through Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources that's listed below here that has information on the disease and also reporting tools, updates on the surveillance and what's going on, where positives are, and so on. And to be honest, it's more up to date than our Department of Agriculture website, which was very active in 2022 when the first H5N1 outbreaks occurred, but seems a little bit out of date right now when I checked it today. So the Fish and Wildlife one is a little bit more up to date if you need to go to one first. I'm kind of waiting on to see if the Department of Ag it's not that they're ignoring this in Kentucky. I just think that they haven't updated their website is all it comes down to. So if you need to reach out to the state veterinarian's office, I'm sure you're going to get a very organized response from them, because I know they're actively involved in surveillance among our facilities here, production facilities. Next slide, Ethan. For those who are on the production side, especially this area in Kentucky, and I'm pretty sure this area of Virginia that we're talking to is not a huge dairy production side of things. But if you are experiencing issues within your herd, there are financial aid available to help offset costs and losses from H5N1 from USDA. I would imagine going to either your USDA Service Center or the FSA office to put you in touch with that program. I believe it's similar to the indemnity program for other losses, but you should reach out. There's also the ability to get your herd tested if you believe there's a positive, but that's all on a voluntary basis at this time, or at least it was over the last few months. I'm not sure if that changed with the new administration that came in, but I'm sure that there's going to be either an update or the structure of response plan currently within USDA CDC. Or it's going to continue on one way or another. So just kind of be checking in on the website that exists through Fish and Wildlife or Kentucky Department of Agriculture on that information. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to hand it over from the Kentucky side, like we did with CWD, to Ethan to take over the Virginia side with HPAI.
Thanks, Dr. Springer. What an excellent overview of HPAI. I know I want to respect everyone's time. I know that there's a game going on that some of you have a vested interest in, so I'm going to breeze through this. I'm going to try not to repeat anything that Dr. Springer covered in terms of pathology or what avian influenza really is, but I kind of move at a fast track pace, but still be thorough enough to where you guys on the Virginia side of things have a better understanding of kind of where we stand as a state in terms of both wild and domestic flocks of birds in Virginia. So just kind of a snapshot of the outbreak timeline for our current H5N1 strain. We first picked it up here in this outbreak in 2022. It was found in January 1st in a hunter harvested duck in North Carolina, and then within like a week or two, it was detected in Virginia, also from a hunter harvested duck, actually a couple of different ducks there. And then it kind of in the next month or two, it kind of just jumped into other species of birds, and even in mammals. Dr. Springer alluded to mammals, I believe seals or sea lions. And it was first found, the first mammal it was found in was in Florida, and it was a dolphin. So yeah, definitely moved around and moved pretty quick. We were finding it at the start of 2022. And the last few years have really been characterized by disease years. So I'm sorry for all the doom and gloom, but in terms of bird flu in wild birds in Virginia, you can see on the screen there. I'm going to move my little here, a little window here with all of our lovely pictures. We've had 102 confirmed cases in wild birds in Virginia since 2022, and this map was updated this month. And we've got close to 20 species of wild birds that it's been confirmed in. Many more that it's suspected, but this is the confirmed list that I found, I think, just last week. So I think it's up to date. As Dr. Springer mentioned, Virginia has taken a similar response plan as Kentucky has, in that we're mainly interested or capable of really monitoring and surveillance of the disease. USDA is spearheading the testing for the most part. We will test as a state agency when we get our hands on birds. But since waterfowl are moving, primarily the movers of this disease across the globe, across the continent, they're crossing multiple state lines and country boundaries. And so our federal agency is really spearheading the testing. And so this map and this list is come from testing that's been confirmed by the USDA. In terms of HPAI and captive birds, we've had a few commercial flocks and a few backyard flocks impacted by this since 2022. Close to 500,000 birds have been impacted. Fortunately for us down here in Southwest Virginia, these have occurred far from us. The Eastern Shore, Northern and Southeastern Virginia has been where the biggest impacts have been felt. Rockingham County, which is getting on, not too far up 81 from us, kind of the northwestern part of the state, has had some impacts there with captive poultry. But we've had it more fortunate than some of the other states in the country have had it in terms of overall impacts. And I hope that things don't take a turn for the worst. I heard recently that Accomack County is still getting smacked pretty hard with it in wild and domestic flocks. In mammals, here's a map of just kind of demonstrating the different types of clades of animals or different groups of animals and where they're distributed across the country that have been confirmed as positive for avian influenza, including a bear that was in eastern North Carolina. Virginia and Kentucky's had a couple of raccoons, I believe, but Virginia so far has not confirmed it in any mammals. Doesn't mean it's not here. Certainly doesn't mean that. It just means it hasn't been confirmed yet. And it definitely can impact a whole suite of species and groups of animals, including cats and weasel family, dogs. Cats especially seem to be susceptible to it. And some cats, especially house cats, may be a little bit more likely to have direct interaction with birds as predators. So what about in dairy cattle in Virginia? This is a sad joke anyway. Cooked chicken, as Dr. Springer alluded to, cooked chicken and eggs have not been shown to be a potential transmission pathway for humans to get the bird flu, or duck for that matter. But so don't take that joke too seriously. Here in Virginia, we have not picked it up, confirmed it in or Kentucky, picked it up in our dairy cattle. Now, I think there was one case in North Carolina, so that's the closest one to us. And in Kentucky, there, I think the closest one is Ohio. So good news on that front. So what is DWR doing about HPAI? I mentioned earlier, we're very similar to Kentucky. The best we can do is try to track and respond to reports of sick and dead birds. So more of a reactive approach. But it's the best that we have right now. We also like to get information out to folks. If you have dead birds or sick birds that you're noticing, we definitely want to hear about it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. But we'll collect samples and test as needed. We certainly have our priorities of new species and new areas take a little bit higher priority. We definitely want to test birds that maybe we haven't been documented to have to be confirmed with HPAI before. We also want to maintain a database, and we do that, of reported events, whether or not the disease is confirmed in them or not. So it's a big collaborative effort in coordination with a lot of other agencies, including our Department of Agriculture, Consumer Services, Department of Health, and many others. So what does an AI infection look like? Dr. Springer, and AI, of course, that's we're not talking about artificial intelligence here. I don't know what that sort of infection looks like. But Dr. Springer kind of went over this. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I just wanted to throw a list on the screen because the next slide, I have guidelines for individuals finding dead birds in Virginia. These are the guidelines taken straight off our website, and you can read those here. The bottom line is, if you see any number of sick or dead eagles, hawks, owls, or turkeys, we want to know about it. For other species like vultures, waterfowl, shorebirds, seabirds, so species or groups of species that we know are succumbing to this virus, we really are looking now at this point for 5 or more individuals in the same general area within 5 days. If that's the case, if it meets those criteria, we want to know about it so that we can go out there and maybe pick up some samples. If you find a dead songbird or other bird species that, by looking at just a simple examination of the context of the situation, if it looks like it got hit by a car or caught by a cat, cats love to drag up their prized catches and leave them on your doorstep. If you can pretty well rule out disease, then there's no need to report it to us. You can safely dispose of that bird using those guidelines there below. For poultry producers and wildlife rehabbers, we've got a couple other numbers that you might want to call, including our state vet's office and our USDA's toll-free number listed there. Unusual illnesses or deaths of rehab waterfowl, seabirds, shorebirds, upland game birds, raptors, avian scavengers like crows or ravens should also be reported to USDA, or you can call the Virginia Wildlife Conflict Helpline, which is on the screen here. And this number is kind of a catch-all number for lots of reasons, lots of wildlife concerns or conflicts you may encounter with lots of species. It's not a disease-specific number, but that is the same number that we encourage you to reach out to if you do notice or suspect that a deer with CWD or a bird with avian influenza. So with that, I think we will close, but we want to open it up first to questions for either myself or Dr. Springer. I do want to just say thank you very much for having us, inviting us to be a part of this Mountain Zoom series. And yeah, so are there any questions? Feel free to drop them in the chat box. Looks like we have a few things here. Yeah, thank you. Yep, thank you, our master gardeners and our master naturalists that are tuning in. Also, feel free to turn your mic back on if you prefer to just ask the question audibly instead of dropping it in the chat box.
I threw a link to our wildlife health reporting tool and website for Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife in the chat box. We have a similar situation where basically anytime you have a wildlife health concern and find an animal that's either unknown causes of mortality or injury, our agency wants to know about it, and they kind of filter through those reports and identify those that seem to be the highest risk or concern level, and have resulted in finding situations of improper use of pesticides, herbicides, and poisoning, among others. So it's a tool that helps us manage our resource and respond to situations like avian influenza and so on. And for those who are in Eastern Kentucky, it's a tool that's heavily used when we have brainworm in our elk and trying to remove those animals from the landscape when they start acting goofy around roads where we don't want them to be, for obvious human health concerns there.
We've got some thank yous in the chat pod. Gentlemen, thank you very, very much for coming on this evening and sharing these two timely subjects. Both this segment is being recorded, so we'll be able to we'll be posting this to I guess our social media pages, or however Phil puts it out, and however Shad puts it out. So you'll be able to review this again. But thank you very much. Phil, do you have anything to add?
I don't. I just appreciate very much. Very good information. I know it's something that a lot of our clients are really concerned about. So thank you very much for this.
Yes, definitely. So I don't have anything else to share. Matt, Ethan, thank you all so much for dropping in this evening, giving us some timely advice here on both these subjects. But I guess this will wrap us up on another edition of the Mountain Zoom. So we hope to see you all next Tuesday evening. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.